Why Horror of Fang Rock is the perfect Doctor Who story for Halloween. Hello and welcome to this week's video. Now it's Horror Month, Halloween month, and I haven't done a Doctor Who video this month as yet, so it's time to do one. And why not talk about a story that is pretty ideal for Halloween night, or indeed any time in cold, dark October. Well, unless you're in Australia, of course. Horror of Fang Rock is one of my absolute favourite Doctor Who stories, and it's certainly one of the ideal candidates for a scary story. Written by veteran Who writer Terence Dicks, a man who knew how to write Doctor Who and then some, and produced, in fact, his very first serial produced by the legendary Graham Williams, my favourite Doctor Who producer, bar none, and script edited by the equally legendary Robert Holmes. I first saw Horror of Fang Rock way back in 1988. It was one of the first batch of stories that I got a friend of mine who I'd just become friends with for a few months to tape for me. I basically got him to tape me a story from each of the pre-Sylvester Doctors, and the Tom Baker one that I selected was the Horror of Fang Rock. Now, I had seen a few Toms before this on the official VHS releases, starting with Revenge of the Cybermen and Robots of Death. I'm not sure if there were any others, possibly Pyramids of Mars, but it was still one of the earliest Toms that I got to see. Now, I think it was off like Satellite or something like that, Super Channel or something like that, or it may even have been an Australian broadcast. I'm not entirely sure, but it was like a 5th or 6th or 50th generation copy, what I got. And the picture quality was so bad, it was actually in black and white. And you know what? And not to mention incredibly fuzzy and, just plain picture quality so bad you cannot imagine watching it nowadays. And you know what? I didn't care. It was still one of the favourite stories that I got from that batch. And 33 years later, good God, I'm old, it's still one of my absolute favourite Tom Baker stories. In fact, I think it was like the late 90s when the official VHS came out, before I actually got to see Horror of Fang Rock in colour. For an awful long time, it was a black and white story to me. And in a way, that's kind of appropriate, because it is kind of a black and white story in many ways. That it's not a very colourful story, so it's not one where losing the colour really makes much difference. In fact, you could argue it even adds to the kind of the creepy and claustrophobic atmosphere, because creepy and claustrophobic is what Horror of Fang Rock is all about. For those of you who don't know, all 6 of you, Horror of Fang Rock was the first story of season 15, the first story of the Williams era, and while the Williams era would move in a different direction from the more horror-oriented Hinchcliffe era, this is still very much in that mould. Because originally, it wasn't going to be Horror of Fang Rock. Originally, there was supposed to be a vampire story called The Witch Mutations, or something like that. The Witch Lords, something like that. The BBC were doing a very lavish adaptation of Dracula at around the same time, and the BBC were like, we don't want Doctor Who doing this as well, either stealing our thunder or seemingly taking the piss. That story ended up being State of Decay in season 18, so we didn't lose it completely, and State of Decay is another classic as well, so who cares? We got this in its place, so we ended up getting another classic in its place. Horror of Fang Rock takes place at the turn of the 20th century. It's set on an island called Fang Rock, a very isolated island in the English Channel. Basically nothing there except a lighthouse, which is there to warn sea travellers of the existence of this island and to keep them away from the rocks. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and a craft shipwrecks on the island with a few survivors. And unfortunately, at around this same time as the Doctor and Leela arrive, something else crashes in the English Channel just off of Fang Rock. An alien spaceship carrying a sole alien, who later turns out to be a shapeshifter. And this alien begins studying and eventually dissecting, one by one, the people trapped in that isolated lighthouse. It's a classic horror movie setup, and it works beautifully. I would argue that Terence Dicks, along with Robert Holmes, are the two people who knew and still knew Doctor Who better than anybody. And when you've got Dicks on absolutely ripper form, and Robert Holmes script editing as well, you know you're in for a treat. Horror Fang Rock works all the way down the line. There's a couple of FX shots that don't quite work, but it hardly matters. It's not an effects-driven story. It's an atmosphere story, and it's basically an Agatha Christie with an alien story. It's 10 Little Edwardians, which is a joke I think I've made once before, but there you go. The cast is great, all very believable, kind of historical, very well by the actors, which include Colin Douglas, who was also in Enemy of the World, and Alan Rowe, who was also in The Moon Base and in The Time Warrior. Both very good stories as well. And Tom Baker and Louise Jameson are both on fantastic form. Tom is just brilliant in this story. I mean, he's as intense as you would expect him to be in a scary, spooky story. And yet there are a couple of moments when he plays it completely the opposite, like grinning when he announces someone's been murdered and that they're all going to die, that are absolutely laugh out loud, freaking hilarious. And Louise Jameson is also fantastic. It's very odd that the actress apparently once seemed to be under the erroneous impression that her character here was originally written to be Sarah, because it's difficult to see how she could have possibly gotten that impression. Leela is really well written in this story, and has some wonderful moments where she's pulling knives on people while telling them to do what the doctor says, slapping Adelaide for being hysterical, and just starts taking her clothes off in order to change in front of the mortified Victorian. Is on top form in this, and the two regulars buoy what is already an excellent story to even greater heights, I would argue. Fang Rock is also, of course, available on DVD, being released way back in 2005. Wow, that's a long time ago. It's not yet on Blu-ray. I'm sure it'll be coming. A season 15 set is inevitable at some point. Maybe even like next year, you never know. And I like season 15 as a whole. Horror Fang Rock is definitely my favourite story of season 15. In fact, Horror Fang Rock probably in my top 10. It's such a rich, sumptuous production, because I mean, it's a historical story, and it's a fairly simple historical story with some fairly simple sets. No, nothing here is kind of pushing the boundaries of what the production was capable of. Everything looks real, atmospheric, grounded, period appropriate, and it all helps with the atmosphere, along with the wonderful script, the terrific dialogue, and an excellent cast, all pulling together in the same direction. Fang Rock is probably in my top 10, to be honest with you, and it's certainly one of the true great scary Doctor Who classics, making it an ideal Doctor Who story to watch any Halloween.